This episode is brought to you by Kia's first three-row, all-electric SUV, the Kia EV9, with available all-wheel drive and seating for up to 7 adults, with 0 to 60 speed that thrills you 1 minute, and available lounge seats that unwind you the next. Visit kia.com/EV9 to learn more. Ask your Kia dealer for availability. No system, no matter how advanced, can compensate for all driver error and or driving conditions. Always drive safely.
Hey everyone, this is Ben. So, we had some initial startup funding to get the Story Collider really going, but that is coming to an end. So, we're starting a fundraising drive. We hope you enjoy these podcasts and believe, as we do, that telling stories of the personal side of science is important. If you do, we hope you'll contribute to keep this going. Head to storycollider.org/donate for more details. And thank you.
A science story, huh?
These NYU scientists,
I felt
right.
I was so
And I just thought, well,
I had figured it out.
It was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Story Collider, where we bring you true stories of how science has affected people's lives. This week's story is from Saswato R. Das. The story was recorded in July 2013 at Union Hall in Brooklyn. The theme of the evening was Close to Death.
It is January 2008, and I'm staring at the muzzle of a gun in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I've been stopped in the car that I am going to by a group of soldiers. And this soldier that I'm looking at is very nervous looking. And if there's anything more worrisome than a soldier with a gun, it's a nervous soldier with a gun. And so he's asking me for my passport, and I give it to him, and I reflect, why am I here? Why am I in the middle of this civil war? Sri Lanka, at that time, was in the middle of a civil war. For 25 years, a group of separatist Tamil militants who controlled the north were fighting the government in the south. And this was the final phase of the war. There had been a ceasefire when I set off from New York, but the day before I landed, that got taken out. And I'm reflecting, why am I here? 80,000 people died in the course of that war. The suicide bombings were a trademark of the Tamil militants. They came up with the suicide vest. And I'm quite afraid. But then the guy gives back my passport and waves me on. Why am I here? It all started with a wrong number 15 years ago. Back then, I was an astronomy graduate student in college, and I had a friend who had gone back to Sri Lanka, and I was phoning him. It was late at night. I may have dialed the number wrong. Back then, in South Asia, there were still these mechanical telephone exchanges. It could have been a fault of that. But I hear this voice at the other end. It's a very British-sounding voice. I asked for my friend by name, and I'm wondering, I know some of his family has studied in London. And while this is going on, there's a slight pause, because back then there were no optical fibers under the sea, so everything was a satellite telephone call. And the voice says, yes, I know who he is. I see him at the club sometimes, but this is Arthur C. Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke. Sir Arthur C. Clarke, as some of you may know, is one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, up there with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Isaac Asimov in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He's actually the reason humans went to the moon. Werner von Braun who was the rocket pioneer in the United States, he persuaded John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, with a copy of the Explorations of Space, which was what Arthur C. Clarke had written. So, I could have told him a lot about how big a fan of his I was. I had read a lot of his books. Actually, it was the promise of space that got me started in astronomy. I loved his short stories. In particular, there is a short story called The 9 Billion Names of God. It tells the story of these two programmers who go to work for these Buddhist monks. The Buddhist monks believe that once you compile the 9 billion names of God, the world will end. And they have enlisted computers to speed up the process because they want to see how the world will end. So these two programmers are fleeing this monastery because they know that the program is going to come to an end, and they're worried that these monks will be really angry. And what's happening, it's a classic Arthur C. Clarke ending. He says one of the programmers looks up as they're fleeing down the Himalayas, and overhead, without any fuss, the stars were going out. So I could have told him all of this, but I botched the moment. I muttered something like, "Oh, I'm a fan of your books," and that was it. What I did do, however, when the bill came, because it was fairly expensive to call overseas back then, was I saved the telephone number. I wrote it down in this little book I had, and 15, well, not quite 15, maybe 14 years later, by then I was a science writer. I was writing for a bunch of magazines, including IEEE Spectrum. And it was the 50th anniversary of Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the first artificial satellite, and I told my editor, wouldn't it be nice to talk to Sir Arthur, because he had been there, he was one of the proponents of space exploration, and my editor said, yeah, go ahead. So I contacted him. I called up that number. It was the same. And the resulting question and answer session turned out to be very popular. So Spectrum and we decided that I'd go in person for this interview. And so here I was in Colombo looking to meet him. And the first thing I did when I got there was call his assistant. But there was bad news. In the time that I was traveling to Colombo, which is where Sir Arthur had made his home for 50 years, he had fallen ill. He had cracked a vertebra, and he was in the hospital. And his doctors had said he couldn't talk to anyone. I was devastated. I had prepared for this trip. I'd reread many of his stories. I was really looking forward to making up for that botched moment 15 years ago. But it turned out, it seemed that it was not to be, that this was something jinxed. But no, Sir Arthur wanted to meet me. He had vetoed his doctor's wishes. And in Sri Lanka, Sir Arthur could veto a lot of things. So what his assistant proposed was that I come to the hospital room and meet him in short bursts. So I would talk to him until he became tired. And so this was the plan. And so that was where I was heading when the soldiers had stopped me. But everyone in Sri Lanka knew who Sir Arthur was. And once I told the soldiers who I was going to meet, that's why they waved me on. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have asked me more questions. So Sir Arthur had been taken to this fancy hospital, the best hospital in Colombo, called Apollo Hospital. And he had his own private suite. And it was really large with 2 rooms, the interior room where he was and the exterior room where, there seemed to be half of Sri Lanka in there. So one of the things that I really noticed was that people were taking off their shoes before they entered the room. And of course, it was a mark of cleanliness. I mean, it was cleanliness. They didn't want germs to go inside the hospital room. But Sri Lanka is also a Buddhist country, and people typically take off their shoes as a mark of respect if they go to visit a temple or something like that. And it was a mark of veneration to Sir Arthur. He was in considerable pain when I met him. He was lying flat. He looked very worn. And I asked him how he was feeling. He didn't respond to that. He apologized for the design flaws of the human body. His mind was fine. It was just his body. And he was 90 years old because he had just turned 90. I asked him a lot of questions over the next few days. And what I started off with was with communication satellites, because it was in 1945 that Arthur C. Clarke wrote a paper in a magazine called Wireless World talking about geostationary satellites. Geostationary satellites are these satellites which are stationary over the Earth, and because they have the same period as the Earth, so they orbit the Earth in the same period. And they are useful for telecommunications because you can reflect signals off them. And he had come up with this idea, and he was called the father of communication satellites. So I asked him about that. And it was a communication satellite that was routing my wrong number 15 years ago. So I asked him why he didn't patent the idea. And I will remember what he told me. A patent is a license to be sued. Which, if you look at the newspapers these days, a lot of litigation is about patents. We also talked about diving. Sir Arthur was an accomplished diver. It was actually what brought him to Sri Lanka. He had been diving in Australia, and on his way back, they stopped in Sri Lanka, and he fell in love with the place. In fact, later on, he and a group of friends actually dived for a treasure ship, and they found a treasure ship off the coast of Sri Lanka, and it was full of silver coins, and they brought it up to the surface. There were 17th century silver coins from the reign of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and some of them are in the Smithsonian Institution today. So if you go to Washington, you can take a look. So we talked about that, and during one of the breaks when he was too tired, I actually went down to the coast of where he had dived and looked at, it was beautiful. But at the end of the discussions, I asked him what he was most concerned with in those days. And he said, extraterrestrials. I said, and back then we had found a few planets around other sun-like stars, but there were nowhere as many as there are today. But he had been writing about extraterrestrials for a long time, and he believed that there was a lot of extraterrestrials, intelligence all over the universe. And he told me that, he thought they were going to be found. I came back from Sri Lanka in mid-January of 2008. The day after I flew out of Colombo Airport, along the same road, actually it was 10 hours after I'd driven past, a government minister was assassinated using a landmine. So things was really bad. Once I got back to New York, I kept in touch with his office. His health deteriorated. He didn't make it much longer. He passed away on 19th of March of 2008. My chat with him turned out to be his last interview, though I wish it weren't. Reflecting back on what he told me, I always wonder why he took so much time to talk to me. Did he have a premonition of death? They say that sometimes people do. Was there something he wanted me to convey to the outside world? All I remember he was very decent. He was a very nice man. He made a very strong impression on me. Childhood authors often take outsized personalities, and they had definitely done that for me. He was a childhood hero. And I still remember that he was extremely decent and very kind, and vetoed every doctor who said, no, you couldn't talk. What happened after he died was I wrote an appreciation of his life for the International Herald Tribune, which is the international edition of the New York Times. I also had recorded part of his words, and that was picked up by public radio here. It got a lot of coverage. And what he did for me was he autographed the copy of my Promise of Space book in his shaky hand. So I still have that, and I cherish that. And thank you for listening.
That was Saswato R. Das. Saswato has written about science and technology for more than 2 decades for publications that include The Economist, Scientific American, New Scientist, IEEE Spectrum, and many more. He has a background in astrophysics and taught undergraduate astronomy within the CUNY system. For more science stories, take a look at storycollider.org, where we have archives of the podcast and upcoming events. And we hope you'll contribute to keeping us going at storycollider.org/donate. The Story Collider is produced by me, Brian Wecht, Darren Barker, and Ari Daniel. The podcast is produced by Rose Eveleth. Additional help from Brooke Williams, Lena Groger, and Justin D'Ambrosio. The theme music is by Ghost. Special thanks to Union Hall for hosting the show, and to Wrong Numbers for sometimes being right. Thanks for listening.
It's time to get your checking account to zero with free checking from PenFed. That's zero ATM fees, zero balance requirements, and zero time spent waiting for your paycheck to direct deposit, because you can receive it up to 2 days early. Open your account with just $25 and see how big zero can be. Apply online today at PenFed.org/free checking. Early direct deposit eligibility may vary between pay periods and timing of payers' funding. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed, insured by NCUA.